Welcome to the Supply Chain Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Sheri Hinish, also called the Supply Chain Queen, and we have a special Earth Day episode where we're going to talk about why energy supply chains must stop treating energy like a line item and as an operating system. We have a special guest, Wesley, who's going to introduce himself in a few seconds. He has a PhD, he has a very illustrious career, and is currently the Director of Energy and Sustainability Solutions at Prologis, also the co-founder of a new community called Sustainability Decoded, with a former Supply Chain Revolution podcast guest, Sandy, who you might recognize from our 10 Big Ideas series. Welcome, Wesley. It's so good to host you today on Earth Day, and also happy birthday.
Thank you, Sheri. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Wonderful. So why don't we kick off? If you could tell folks a little bit about the amazing career and origin story that you have.
Yeah, for sure. So I didn't start my career in sustainability. I had sort of the first half of my career was a completely different industry. I was an intelligence officer for the U.S. government, civilian intelligence officer, I should say. The agency I worked for is a bit of a mouthful, but it's the U.S. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. For those of us that you probably heard of the other three-letter agencies like NSA or CIA, NGA is also, they call it the Big Five. So there's those three, and then DIA and NRO. So that was my career. I did an undergrad in geographic information systems, went and I did a couple things, but eventually have my career as a civilian intelligence officer and got to do a lot of different stuff, which I'll maybe get to, but it was interesting. My first official assignment was actually at U.S. Transportation Command, or it's called TransCom for short. The way we always describe it is they move beans, bullets, and Band-Aids all over the world for all military branches, all COCOMs, all locations. So the U.S. had sort of a footprint, the military all over the world. And TransCom is how logistics happen.
Triple B.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it was about sort of geospatial intelligence for that logistics mission. And that was probably, when I look back on it, like what started to push me down the path of really focusing on energy and then eventually climate. But like a project I worked on there was looking at when you fly air routes, it's called air traffic control routes. There's routes that you actually fly on these highways in the sky. And you can look at all these different factors that would impact the logistics of that. Biggest one being fuel burn rate, but there are other things, whether you have diplomatic clearance for the overflight for countries. And again, it'll probably be no surprise to your audience, but it's often a surprise for a lot of folks, is ultimately wars are acts of supply chain logistics. And the superior supply chain logistics is such a deciding factor in how conflicts turn out. Probably made a lot more front and present to everyone with what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz. But that's true all the time, by the way. It's not just when something like this happens, but it's not as well known. So
Right.
yeah, that was a big one for me. I later deployed to Iraq as a senior data manager for that theater in 2009 to 2010. I know that's been a while now since we've been in that conflict, but to remind everyone, for every gallon of fuel that was actually consumed in that theater, it took 20 gallons to get it there, right? Those logistics convoys were the number one cause correlation casualties in that war. For every 39 fuel convoys we had in that war, at least one casualty happened. IED roadside bombs were the biggest ones. So, I mean, it ended up being one of the most vulnerable areas in terms of those logistic operations. But going into those fuel convoys and moving it, I moved it quite a bit as part of my job. So I was kind of hopping to all the different forward operating bases. It becomes very real, like in terms of just how critical that is. Ultimately, like, again, it's when I deployed to Iraq too, that's right before that, 2 months before that I became a father. I knew at that point, like I wanted to do something in the private sector and something related to energy, or at least not for the US government, something related to energy. Like I knew climate was sort of a factor and involved and tied in. I think I have a better understanding of that now, but it took some time. And then it ultimately led to sort of the career path that I ended up taking.
Yeah, you've just described like pretty much a military like background, but you landed very much in sustainability. You went back to school for sustainability, have a PhD. You have worked at Amazon. You're now working for Prologis. I think what was most interesting when we met was that you've lived so many lives so far that most people probably don't have the cojones to even try like 2 of those lives.
Yeah, I've always been wired that way when it came to my career, right? And just life, and that maybe it's driven out of curiosity or whatever, I don't know. Where I had a sort of, I think a really good career. I was in the sort of fast track for leadership and within the agency and was doing stuff there. But once I knew, I was like, oh, no, this is where my curiosity is taking me. This is what I want to do. It's thought, no, it's like maybe some of these skills will be transferable. I think I can have some kind of impact here. And I don't worry too much about sort of titles or other things that I've invested in other places. And I think I've had a pretty fun career.
And I think the timing of this conversation is really important because, I mean, in a lot of ways, we're at multiple inflection points. So I think the timing of this episode on Earth Day is even, more impactful because people are bringing in like their personal value system into their professional world. And you have this multifaceted journey that you kind of stumbled into supply chain.
Yeah.
And then it's, the curiosity and the focus on energy, I think, has, made you an incredible thought leader in sustainability right now. So I want to talk about your thesis. And you've said that supply chain decisions, that they look like they're about cost and resilience or emissions, but almost always underneath the decisions are about energy. So unpack that for us.
Yeah. Let's step back a minute and talk about something that I think people that come from sustainability often, maybe it's an uncomfortable topic a little bit. So I'm going to be pretty candid. If you look at any measure of human development, whether it's GDP per capita or sort of a proxy for that going back to the Stone Age, right? It goes almost flat for like 300,000 years, and then it turns directly vertical. And where that knee is essentially, and this is the part that gets uncomfortable, the discovery of fossil fuels, specifically around coal, then oil, then natural gas. And that explosion in human development, it's not because there's something magical about those three energy sources per se, but the ability to sort of extract and expound upon what that can deliver at scale. Every indicator of human thriving took off and went from sort of flat to vertical. It's led to so many things, right, that are other correlates that help drive that. But ultimately, if you take it from an emissions point of view, from a carbon point of view, right, and sustainability, it's the same thing where they say, well, emissions come from buildings and transportation and different sectors of the economy. And with the exception of agriculture, when you fundamentally look at that at first principles level, you're like, it's all energy. I don't even think it's an understatement to say that it's critical or something like that. If you took out energy, say you took out like Electrotech energy, which is, more modern forms of energy in terms of solar, wind, battery storage, EVs, heat pumps, and you took out our modern fossil fuels, we'd go back to wood burning, right? And imagine that economy. But we lived like that for hundreds of thousands of years. That's why it was so flat, because our energy.
Some people still live like that.
That's true. That's exactly right. Yeah. Right. And you can look at sort of what their sort of economic activity and thriving looks like. And I don't want to romanticize sort of this idea of what life was like 300 or 400 years ago. I mean, I've been camping a lot, so I have an idea of what that was like, right? It's great for a time, but I very much enjoy and appreciate the ability to live in a modern and thriving society. And to me, again, that always comes back to energy. So if you think about extracting a resource, manufacturing a resource, shipping a resource, delivering a resource, whether that be virtual or physical, whether it's atoms or electrons, that's all just an expression of different energy generation and storage and transfer assets, right? So I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but I see the world through that lens. And again, that goes back to being at TransCom, being in Iraq, doing my PhD in this topic, working at Amazon, and well, actually even some BCG cases that we did for energy as well. The work I do now at Prologis, et cetera. Like I see it as a through tie both to my career, but also just in terms of how the global economy works.
Yeah, this is super insightful. I think what I love about it too is that you have a very different lens on supply chain. And so this is a two-part question. What happens when an organization actually starts to open the aperture and starts to view energy this way? And then what are the biggest blind spots that you see in how large enterprises are approaching energy in their supply chain strategy right now?
Yeah, it's good. And I think these questions are highly related. I think we tend to talk about energy in terms of inputs, right? We talk about barrels of oil, we talk about BTUs of gas, we talk about gigawatts of solar, that type of thing. These are all inputs, but no one's actually consuming a gigawatt of solar or a barrel of oil directly. What happens is you're consuming these final useful outputs of energy services, right? We're primarily categorized under, my categorization is heat, propulsion, and electricity. When you open the aperture of how you see this and then see the primary role of energy, you start to realize like, oh, I can program in different sort of system architectures to deliver however those three categories of things I need for my business, right? So you pay the CapEx, the capital expenditure up front, but you know what your OpEx is going to be. You have some maintenance on wind, you have less maintenance on solar, you have to clean the panels and whatnot. So you get a lot of buffering and stability. We didn't mention this, but I'm a writer and co-founder for a newsletter called Sustainability Decoded, and I've been writing about this a lot in a bunch of different aspects. One on how China has been able to, thank you, how China has been able to how they've built out particularly their solar production capacity and how much of a difference that's made in their energy mix system. A really fascinating example of what's going on in Pakistan right now, which is a story that really started in 2022. They added 25 gigawatts between 2022 and 2025 of solar, all rooftop distributed solar. Only about 5 gigawatts of that was sort of official within their net metering program. The other 80% was sort of DIY, WhatsApp and TikTok video tutorial type things to
I love
install
it.
that solar. So if you take, they used to do a lot of actually electricity generation from oil, but that nuclear, all that combined is less than what they have in solar right now. That's saved them, I think, up to, I have to go back and look at the article, I think it's $12 billion so far in avoided fossil fuel costs, right?
Wow.
And they're being hit, as is the rest of Asia, I think a lot harder by the impact of the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz. But again, that diversification and that rethinking, like what are the actual energy service we're trying to deliver at a country level, then you see like, oh, when these shocks and volatility happens, they're a lot more sort of inoculated, against that. I think the same is true for companies. And then as you start to think about how that gives you, again, those moats and those competitive advantages, that becomes key. You're also developing supplier relationships, which are really important. Because eventually I think you start to see more and more players in the market come to this realization. And now they're scrambling for contracts and relationships. And again, how that affects their supply chains.
100%. Like you don't wait until a crisis to start SRM and the strategic reach out to your key suppliers. So let's just step back for a second. We're going to come back to Sustainability Decoded because we
Yeah,
have an
sure.
announcement. But if we step back for a supply chain or ops leader listening right now, what's like the first best step?
So if you're on the ops side, and then my advice for what happens if you're a supply chain side, it'll be these steps, but for your suppliers. Start to look at what your energy options are. Right. Yeah, it's true for sure if you're a Prologis customer, but you start to see like there are a lot of ways, especially if you're moving into renewables, and we can talk about why that becomes so important outside of the sustainability or sort of emissions goals or structure they might have, just looking at it purely in cost terms. There are other things that you could look at, like there's green tariffs in a lot of countries and states where you can procure renewable energy or clean energy via green tariffs. You could do on-site solar. Where I work in Prologis, we do that. We do on-site battery storage. We do on-site EV chargers. You can look at off-site. So companies like Amazon and Walmart and many others are huge leaders in this space. Microsoft, Google, all the tech companies of funding these giant sort of solar farms, wind farms, et cetera, because it can generate so much renewable energy. There's price stability with that. And then they're also getting the claim of the abated emissions that would have occurred had you generated that energy in other ways. So start to look at those options. There's advisory services for this as well, companies that will help you start to look at that, but looking at it through a price and strategic lens. Right? Can I get immediate cost savings now? That's often true for on-site solar and a couple other activities you could do. And then also, can I lock in price stability going forward? Also,
Right.
on the power side, most countries, and certainly in the United States and most districts, you're going to expect escalation of utility prices. So you can stabilize some of that with these solar or wind projects. Right? So those are all the things that you can start to look at. Now, if you are working in the supply chain management side, and I worked in that similar type of role when I was at Amazon. I was head of supplier decarbonization within global procurement organization. It was that same activity, but then sort of helping those major suppliers along. In some cases, they had a quite sophisticated program, and so it was like, great, we could exchange information and see if there's any way we could help each other. Some would just getting started or had no idea how to do that. The easiest way to think of it, I always say, is if you burn it in something you own, like a truck or methane to heat a building, that's scope 1. If you plug it in, the emissions associated with generating that electricity is scope 2. Everything else in your value chain is scope 3. And typically, most of those emissions come from your upstream supply chain. Because if you buy a product or service, particularly products, it took emissions, or oftentimes emissions are associated with, again, the extraction, the manufacture, the shipping through the tiers of supply chains that you're now inheriting as you buy that. You start to treat emissions that way. And then when your
Yeah.
suppliers say, well, wait, how do I do that? I didn't even realize there was a sort of shadow spec that was within my products, right? And then you could say, well, there's renewable energy options or distribution models that you could look at for your activity and then also for your supplier's activity, right? And you can sort of go up the chain there. So it's a little more complicated if you're directly managing the suppliers, but also your opportunity for impact's a lot bigger because you can talk to all your major suppliers. And if you're in ops, like you can look directly at your scope 1 and 2 activity because you're also probably a supplier to someone else. And, you can see sort of where it sits in the chain.
Absolutely. We have a bit of an announcement. Earth Day is a proper day. It's also your birthday.
It is.
But
It's a special
so
one
we're
for me. I'm
giving a
turning
gift
50.
to listeners with a big green bow
Yeah.
because you've been building this thesis through Sustainability Decoded with your co-founder, Sandy, who was on our 10 Big Ideas series. So give folks a little bit on Sustainability Decoded, how they can find you all, reach out, your partnerships. And also, you are going to be one of our community partners. So we're
Excited about
super
that.
thrilled. Yeah.
For sure. As you mentioned, sustainability, it's sustainabilitydecoded.com. So just the two words smashed together.com. There's a LinkedIn sort of site as well. And we post some content there and we recycle a lot of the newsletter articles that go out. So it's a newsletter. As you mentioned, Sandra Leva and I co-founded it. We had met and worked together at Amazon, actually. We were both product managers on something called the Sustainability Solutions Hub that has is a huge product, I guess I should say, because it still exists at Amazon. It's for all the selling partners on Amazon, whether they're sellers or vendors. They now can use that portal for sustainability for a lot of the things that I just described, actually. Very similar in terms of the resources I created, and she created some other resources there. And so we thought about like, how do we sort of open access virtually in a way and also pay it forward? You get thrown so much stuff at you and it's just expected, whatever it is, if it touches sustainability in any way, you are now the expert on it. Or maybe your small team is the expert on it and you're going to make changes and also do reporting and also be compliant with laws and regulations. And it's always amazing. I'd also gotten asked a lot of times, like people would reach out on LinkedIn or whatever, typically people more junior in their career and say, hey, is there a course you recommend or a training or whatever? And I'm like, yeah, there's tons, right? Like there's stuff out there, but it's not going to be the one that sort of gives you the playbook for your particular problem or situation, because most likely you might be writing that playbook. So it's a little more evergreen in terms of the content we put out of sustainability professionals who are working through different problems and challenges. And it's not about like, here's how you specifically solve this reporting challenge or what the latest GHG protocol means for you in this line item on your ESG report, and more about what are the approaches that you take? What are the things that are happening? For me, I write a lot on the energy side that will impact like what the decisions you make, the things you should be looking out for strategically. So we try to take that content, package it up in a way that I think is useful to the general audience. And then with the newsletter goes out every Wednesday morning. And then we'll repost content on LinkedIn and whatnot. And we're always open for other collaborators. We call them field decoders. We've co-written some stuff with other people that we know or are friends with or have worked with. So we want to get more people to contribute to those articles, to write about like their experiences, to write about how they overcame challenges, et cetera, because we think that's the best way to pay it forward to everyone. So yeah, it's been going great. Like we've been getting good traction on the newsletter and it seems to resonate with people. And so then we get reach outs and whatnot about it. We're pretty happy about it. It's been good.
It's amazing content, which is also why I wanted to tap you and Sandy on the shoulder. Today is Earth Day. So not only has Wesley very brilliantly unpacked what it means to rethink energy on a day dedicated to planetary stewardship, but also we share the world. And if we want to get to a regenerative future that leaves no one behind, that we can all be proud of, it also takes community. And so first I want to thank you and acknowledge this is your personal milestone, right?
Yeah.
It's your birthday.
Yeah.
Incredible that you were
I'm half
born
a
on Earth
century
Day,
old.
but
So yes, but it's awesome. I was born on Earth Day, in fact. So I feel like I was some ways born for this. So yeah.
born for this.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, you were born for it.
Yes.
But also, I want to direct anyone listening right now, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you're listening or streaming on iTunes, Spotify, if you just pick it up on TikTok, Instagram, or LinkedIn, make sure that you check out the notes, the comments, the content, and go check out Sustainability Decoded, because a lot of times we hear about, I don't know what to do. I need a playbook or I need to learn more information. It's here. Any final thoughts for people listening, Wesley, on this very important day in 2026?
I think you've captured it, Sheri. If there's anything I would add is Never underestimate the impact that your life or career decisions or choices will make, right? We talked about this kind of at the top of the segment around I made some odd zigs and zags in my career or whatnot. And if you are focused, and I imagine if you're listening to this episode, you're probably more impact oriented in your career, let's say, right? And money's important and sort of do what you need to do to take care of yourself. But if you're thinking about how you have that impact in your career, we are tackling global problems, literally, right? And that sounds fun to say, but the reality is when you're working on it, you worry or you have doubts about like, am I really making an impact? Don't underestimate like what is the result of the things that you're working so hard for. Every now and then, just take a quick moment to step back and actually try to take an objective look at that. And I think it will help you calibrate on like, hey, I did make the right choice and I am making a difference in the spaces and domains where I'm trying to. I think that's important. It's can be daunting, right? But it's worth it.
Yeah, it feels harder because your calling is higher
A
in
good
a
way to
lot
put it.
of ways. Yeah. Thank you so much, Wesley. It was such a pleasure to
Thank
finally
you.
host you.
Yeah, thanks.
Again, people, go look up Sustainability Decoded. Right? This is an important moment in time. And thank you so much for sharing everything, your origin story, all of your hard-earned lessons and insights with our audience.